You said check that bottle. Hey everyone, I'm Mike, a grateful member of Alanon.
Hey, Mike.
I've been in the rooms for, I guess it's 14 years now. God. Al-Anon's a little different, I understand, from AA. I came into the rooms, and I was in the rooms for 2 years before I got a sponsor. And it was cathartic for me because I grew up with alcoholism. I grew up in Michigan with alcoholism. So, boys, I'm glad you're here. Fort Myers, it's where my parents moved. So, wait a minute, I recognize you. I'm a grateful member of Alanon. I have, like Steve said, my home group is down the hallway at 7 o'clock on Mondays. I started this program working it out on the West Coast, and I will tell you, I work this program like my life depends on it, because it does. It really does. I wouldn't be here. I grew up with alcoholism. I found out when I got into Alanon that a lot of the things that my dad taught me growing up came from this program and from Alanon. He was a double winner, as we call it. And a lot of what he taught me came from these programs. And he never said, this is what the program says, or this is what you do. But he did never, my parents were divorced. He never talked smack about my mom. He never said negative things about them. When I asked him about he had some Alanon literature on his bedside table. He just said, well, your grandparents have some issues, and that's that program's my way of dealing with it. He never said, they're drunks, and So, my dad was the first alcoholic in my life. I remember driving back from 7-Eleven, having my Slurpee. I was really young. And I remember my dad tipping the bottle back and the brown liquid through the streetlights. And, it's a fond memory for me. I love earth tones because of that. Not that it shows today, and I remember saying to the guy at 7-Eleven knew my dad. I remember saying to my dad in 7-Eleven, like, Dad, you drink a lot. And the guy behind the counter goes, yeah. If he knows. But I do remember, I remember that. I remember the crafts from the wine that my dad used to drink, only because those crafts became the orange juice crafts at our Sunday brunches after he got sober. We talked a lot about alcoholism growing up, not from the program standpoint, but from what it means. I remember my dad making his 9-step amends to me. Like I said, so much of what I learned in this program, I learned from him. My dad got sober in 86, as my stepmom put it. He got sober for good in 88. My dad died in 2004 after years and years of abusing prescription medication. I remember calling him. I lived in California, and I worked at 7:30. I would have to call him at 7 in the morning if I wanted to talk to him. Because if I called him after work, he was gone. He was just not there anymore. And I learned that from him. I learned to accept people for who they are and, the place they're in. My sister got sober when she was 20. She did she pulled a lot of geographics. I don't remember much of her drinking. I just remember the drama. I remember with the drinking came a lot of mental illness. My mom, I think, is narcissistic, selfish, self-centered, all those things. When my sister got sober when she was 20, she's not sober anymore, and that's okay. I remember her, I have a nephew, and that's kind of when I got in the program, and I'll get to that. I remember her, we were both living in California. I was in the program by then. And she had decided she was moving back to where we grew up, back to Michigan, because she had connected with one of her high school boyfriends online. So she was picking up and she was moving with my nephew across the country. I asked her, has this guy seen a picture of you? Because she wasn't the person she was in high school. Does he know does he know anything about you? And she said, no. And I said, God, I love you. She said, can you take me to the airport? I said, sure. So she came to my house the night before, and 2 of her program friends dropped her off. I told her I loved her and watched her and her entourage, the dog, the kid, the stroller, get on the plane. And, I got the call 2 weeks later. It didn't work out. She's living with friends. She's on the street. She's living in the van. God, I love you. I can't change it, My mom would never, she's one of those people that would never admit any shortcomings, anything like that. I believe, she medicates herself with her mental illness by drinking, but that's not for me to say, and I accept that. So, that all being said, it took me a long time to get into Alanon. I got into Alanon, I moved into a new house, and this really good-looking blonde across the street invited me over, and we're sitting on her couch, she's just drinking a glass of wine, and she's like, I go to this program called Alanon. And I went, wait. I'm like, you're drinking? And she's like, well, yeah, Alanon is, this, AA is this. Now, that struck me because when I moved to California in 2000, I hung out with my sister a lot. And at the time, my sister was working a good program, and she had a group of people that she worked the program with. I think there's 6 or 7 of them. They were real close, thick as thieves. And I hung out with them, I went to AA meetings with them. They knew our history. They knew my sister's story. They knew a little bit about me. None of them knew what Alanon was. I ran into one of those people in my program years and years later, and I was sitting in a circle, and this guy's staring at me, and I immediately recognized him. He's staring at me, and he can't place me. And I just said, after the meeting. That was my sister's best friend from when I moved to California. He told me that of those 7 or 8 people, he was the only one of that group that was still sober. And 2 of them were dead. I knew it before, I knew it then, and I know it now. It's a deadly disease, and so is Alanon. I've lost people in both programs that I was very close to. So I did eventually get into Alanon. I went to meetings. Where I started the program, there were a lot of meetings, and I went to a lot of meetings. But growing up with the disease, I learned not to trust anybody, to hide myself. I developed, major defects of character. I lied about everything, and I mean everything, who I was, what I did for a living, because I didn't want anyone to know. So it took a while for me to sit in the rooms and feel comfortable, and I had no self-confidence. I'm an introvert. I tried really hard to hang around after meetings, and finally one day I'm putting chairs away, and this woman says, "How you doing?" And I said, "Good." And I went to move, and she stepped in my way. She's like, "How are you doing?" I said, "I'm doing good." And she just looked at me and she smiled. She didn't move. An hour and a half later, I realized that I had met the female, older version of myself. And that was kind of where I got that my first spiritual awakening. It was where I learned that I couldn't keep going the way I was. And I eventually found a meeting. Of course, my bottom wasn't when my dad died or when my sister, well, it was kind of when my sister got pregnant. But let me back up a little bit. My dad's funeral, my sister and I were living in California. We weren't really close. We flew to Fort Myers, and my dad had just recently passed away. And I'm a mess. I'm just like, if you've lost a parent, that feeling of just being raw. And I'm just trying to communicate with my stepmother. Her sister and her family was there. My sister was ripping the house apart looking for my dad's stash. My stepmom said after my dad died, she flushed $40,000 worth of prescription medication. And that's what my sister was looking for. My sister was fine at the house. We get to the motel. We're supposed to be staying in the same room, and it blows up. She goes crazy. And she's like, "You're not staying in this room. You're not doing," and I'm like, "Oh, okay." So I go to the front desk. I'm getting another room. She comes out. She makes a scene in the hallway. Apparently, she didn't find what she was looking for in the house, and that was just her way of dealing. I didn't see her. We went to the funeral. We flew back home. I didn't see her for 7 years, and I found out she was pregnant. She was in the program. Apparently, well, I like to tell the story this way. She looked all around the room, and she picked out a sperm donor, and she got pregnant. I have a nephew who's 10 years old, and if I'm hearing correctly, his father has seen him twice at an AA picnic and one other time. He's not in his life, which is great for me because I'm the fun uncle. I'm the only uncle. I take pride in the fact that I got this kid that I love more than anything in the world. But when I found out my sister was pregnant, that's kind of what spurred me to get some help, to start working the program, working the steps, and because I wanted a relationship with my sister. I hadn't seen her in 7 years. I had said many, many, many times, "Okay, that's it. I can't deal with her. I'm done with her. She's out of my life." She's my only sister. Our dad had passed away. Our stepmom, she had her own whatever, and our mom. So she's my only family, and I do the best I can to keep in contact with her. I haven't talked to her in about a year and a half, which is kind of what happens. She starts dating someone, and she goes down that path again, and so anyway. I got in the program, and I found a group of people that work Alanon the way Lois started the program, which is Lois started the program in the same room in Akron that Bill was having his meetings. It's just Lois was in the kitchen or downstairs or wherever you want to put them in the house, meeting with the wives of the alcoholics, because as it turns out, this disease affects more than just the alcoholics. Well, there wasn't literature. She started this program using the Big Book, and they substituted words in the Big Book, and like serenity for sobriety, distorted thinking for drinking, my favorite, family reunions for bars. I'm drawing a blank on the rest of them, but we would read the Big Book from the Alanon perspective, and for a lot of us in that program, it made a lot of sense. I'm not an alcoholic, but damn, did I try to be. But unfortunately, I couldn't go the distance. I spread my addictions out over a wide berth of things, but. If I had an addiction, it'd be smoking cigarettes. Ooh, yeah. So I got in this group of people that it was stepped up Alanon, and they worked the program like their lives depended on it, because it does. And we used the AA Big Book and the 12 and 12, and read it from an Alanon perspective. And when I met my sponsor, he said, "This is what we do." And now, my sponsor had a sponsor, and his sponsor had a sponsor, and we all did it the same way. And I sponsored the same way. Show up early, sit in the front, greet newcomers, read literature every day, pray from our knees every day. I've said the 12th and 7th, or the 4th and 7th, 3rd and 7th prayer. I don't know. I've said it at least 4 times every day for 12 years. I know like I said, like my life depends on it. Read literature every day. Greet newcomers, show up early, pray from our knees. There were rules that went along with this. One of my addictions, one of my coping mechanisms was relationships. And it was ultimately the demise of a relationship that got me into the program. And, I was dating a woman who lived across the street from me. And it was that finally got me. When she broke up with me, it was that finally got me into the rooms. And I'll tell you, my home group at that time was a Friday night meeting at 5:30. I would show up at 4:30 or 5 to have coffee down the street. I'd hang out with the guys in the program. I'd go to, it was a speaker meeting. We'd go to fellowship afterwards. I would be feeling good. I would be serene, and I would drive home. And I'd drive down my street, and about halfway down my street, I would remember she's dating somebody else. And that somebody else has Fridays off. And his car is right there across the street. And that was a shocking revelation, because it really killed my serenity every Friday night. But every Friday night, I did forget that was going to happen. So there's always that. But like I said, that was one of my coping mechanisms. And sure enough, I wasn't allowed to date when I worked the steps. And I worked the steps the first time for us in that program. It took 9 to 10 months. And about a month after I finished, it was my 9th step that I had to get through. About a month after that, the neighbor from across the street called me up. And we got back together, and I told my sponsor, and he looks at me, and he got mad at me for the first time. He goes, "You're like an alcoholic. You work the steps, and you go into a bar, someone slides you a drink, and you pick it up without even thinking." And I went, fuck. Because he was right. He was right. I got right back in that relationship. And I knew I shouldn't. So, I'm a work in progress. But, like I said, it's been 14 years and 12 years of working the steps. And, it wasn't until I moved to North Carolina from California in 2018. And even my close friends, people I consider my brothers and sisters in California, when I got here and I'd call back to check in with them, several of them said, "Mike, I had no idea your mom was an alcoholic," because I never talked about it. That was her business. She is who she is, and so I was trying to follow the ideas of Alanon. But when I moved here, I was staying with her. She was having surgery, and it was like the denial, even after all those years, was so strong that I didn't even go there. I wasn't even addressing that in my program. And my sponsor at the time said, maybe it was my higher power protecting me. But I'll tell you, I showed up to Monday meetings, and there was no recovery. There was absolutely no recovery. I had gone back to every defective character that I have to cope with living in the same house with the person who raised me. One thing I didn't mention is, my parents were divorced. My mom went through a second divorce when I was 15. I was a freshman in high school. And my ex stepfather and my mom were both in the house with me for 10 months because neither of them wanted to relinquish control of the house. You can imagine what a crazy place that was to have two people that were divorcing in the house, fighting every day, no semblance of serenity or anything. And I mean, I coped the way I was taught to cope, with marijuana and drinking. Because that's what I grew up with. So when the divorce was over, he finally moved out. She got the house. I turned 16 and I got a car. And I got convinced to take care of the house in Michigan while she moved to Florida, basically. She was just going for 2 weeks. But she was barely home from the middle of my sophomore year through until I went to college. And then she moved back and promptly kicked me out of the house. And I went to live with my dad and my stepmom. And it took me about a week to realize, why wasn't I doing this the whole time? Why wasn't I here the whole time? It was a family. We had breakfast. We had, I had people that were there every day. So, it's for me, it's a disease of not understanding people. I mean, the more I get into this program, the more I don't understand myself. Where am I for time? The more I don't understand people. I never will. I don't understand myself. The more time I spend in this program, the more I'm exposed to people, the more I'm exposed to more life situations, the more I get to apply this program to my life. I don't understand people. And I have coping mechanisms. Like I said, I was, 7, 8 years in the program, and I went right back to the coping mechanisms of being a 15-year-old kid. And that's scary, because I know I can go there, But where I am now is, I have this peace that has come over me. I sometimes laugh. I'm like, is it that, people don't think it's like that, whoa, dude, surfer California thing. But it's not. It's a higher power. It's a spiritual awakening. I've had a lot of situations. I mean, I got into the program, and when I started, those first few years, they in the meetings they pass around a newcomers packet, and people would put their names on the back and their phone numbers to call. And I collected a bunch of them. I never picked up the phone, but I got a call. I was living on one side of the bay, my sister was living on the other, and I got a call from my sister's sponsor. And she said, and I'd been in the rooms for maybe a year. I got a call, and her sponsor said, your sister was on the street in front of her apartment, passed out, and they've taken her to the hospital to pump her stomach. What do you want me to do with the baby? This is 9 o'clock on Saturday. I'd worked the program so that I wasn't afraid to pick up the phone to get these calls. And I learned that when the call comes, that's when I would deal with it. Not, 99% of what I worry about never happens. So I grabbed my meeting list and I start driving across the bay, and someone in the program says, I'm on the way, come pick me up. What? No, it's fine. I don't want to bother you. I'm on the way, pick me up, and we'll deal with it. So we drove across the bay. We tried to find the stroller. My sister was in the hospital. They were pumping her stomach. The guy she was dating, who I suppose she was with, was nowhere around. Her sponsor didn't know she was drinking. And I had to face the fact, this might be it. I may become I may go from the fun uncle to the fun father, overnight. And I found out that in asking my mom for help, because she was living in the area, that wasn't going to happen either. She said, at some point, I took my nephew for the night without a crib, pushed my bed up against the wall. I mean, he was an infant at the time. I had no idea what was going on with my sister, but I had enough recovery to know that all I could do was deal with what was in front of me. And took my nephew to my mom's house, which is about an hour north, and my mom took the baby because she was able to get a car seat. And she made me promise up and down that I would be right behind her. Because her biggest fear was not that my sister was going to die, not that she wasn't going to be able to take care of the baby. Her biggest fear was that she was going to have to take care of the baby by herself. And to know me, you know that that's not something I was going to do. She was projecting her own thoughts onto me. So my sister survived, but I got that call 3 more times. And, I in my program, I had a very serious conversation with my sponsors, my great sponsor, I guess. Like I said, it's a lineage. And because my biggest fear came to be, what happens if I have to take care of my nephew? I didn't feel like I was financially in a place to do that. And we had a conversation, and this was another spiritual awakening for me, that if my sister dies and I decide to take care of my nephew, that is my choice. I do not have to do that. There are other alternatives. And it took me a second, but that is the reality. I have a choice. These are things that I control. I'm not obligated to take care of my sister or my nephew or my stepmom if things go wrong. Now, my personality being I wouldn't do that. I love my nephew more than anything in the world, and I have faith in a higher power, so I would work it out. But I got that call 3 more times, and I wasn't always able to drop everything and go, because the last time it happened, I had just moved to North Carolina from California. I was living with a mother who I was suddenly remembering what it was like to grow up with, and I was questioning all of my life choices at a certain point, and it may have been after, I think it was prior to this, but my sister was in the hospital again. She was in a coma. And they're up in Michigan, and I don't really know my nephew at this point. And her best friend's telling me I have to come up and take care of my nephew. And I told her, I'm like, he doesn't know me. He knows you. I can't. I'm not in a position to. And that was hard, but that was the right thing for me. I was not able to. My life was a mess. And dropping everything to go try and take care of a nephew wasn't something I could do. But I couldn't have done that without the program. And it may sound crass, but like I said, if it weren't for the program, I wouldn't be here. I may not have survived that. Because I had my hands full when I first moved here with dealing with my own life choices and, questioning what may be mistakes. I'm getting. Eventually I figured someone would do something. So like I said, I work the program like my life depends on it. Part of my program back then, and even to this day, is going to open AA meetings. When I was thinking about this, I got into the program because I was surrounded by alcoholics, and they were driving me crazy. So as an Alanon, to come into a room full of alcoholics and open my heart is kind of like showing up to an exam without my pants on. It's like being thrown into the lion's den. But I'm grateful for this program. I'm grateful that when I walk into this meeting that I am welcomed. And, I feel more comfortable in a room full of alcoholics than I do in a room full of normal people. And that's because I'm surrounded by alcoholics in my life. Thanks for letting me share.
Great. Thanks. It's interesting. It's a privilege to follow Mike in this discussion. We're in the same fellowship week after week. I actually head to Florida for a few months, but I come back and it's like I never left because we just have this really solid group. Is Courage to Change in Alanon. And today, I was like, what am I going to say? How am I going to get to the point? How am I going to get to what is Alanon? How was my life affected by alcoholism? And the hardest part is that I didn't know half of what Mike said until tonight. Because in Alanon, we focus on ourselves. We focus on our experiences bring us to talking about the steps and how, we've learned that we're powerless and all the different steps. We follow the same 12 steps, in case you're not aware, that they're the exact same wording. So it is a privilege to be a part of that. And a few weeks ago, we had a meeting on gratitude. And one of the things we're frequently grateful for is the alcoholics in our lives. And the reason for that is because it brings us this program that has given me peace that I never had before. I celebrated my 10-year anniversary in Al-Anon in October 7th of this year. And it was the same anniversary date that I share with my son, who is now 29, but at the age of 19 had hit his rock bottom and admitted himself to rehab. And for the grace of God and the grace of the program, he is sober today and has been sober since that day. So that's the end of my story, sort of, his story. Not my story, but his story. So a lot of people come into Al-Anon through AA. Either maybe they're an alcoholic and they find out that they really need Al-Anon too, because there's other people in their lives that are dealing with alcohol and maybe not in the same way that you are with your program. So they come in that way. Sometimes they come in and they sit in the room and they realize halfway through they're in the wrong room. They need to be in Al-Anon, and so Steve brings them upstairs and they're in the right room. Another way that people come in to Al-Anon is like straight through the room, like I did. And I've told this story in our meeting. I said on October 6th, I was at a wedding, and my son was being arrested, pulled over, hit a woman and her husband. She was pregnant. She went in an ambulance. And by the time I arrived, because I was at this wedding, and by the time people got a hold of me, they had him with handcuffs in the back of a car. And he was my beloved third child. I had already lost a child at the age of 16 when a man ran a red light. He was not drunk, but it was still, he ran a red light. My daughter was killed. My husband was seriously injured. And so I'd already lost one child. And now I'm facing, and I had been facing that. This wasn't just like, he got drunk and hit a car. This was many years of typical behavior, changing friends, the school calling. A parent, this was a good one on denial. Parent came up to, couple came up, they lived in our neighborhood, and they came up and knocked on our door, and they wanted to discuss our son and their son, and we put them in the formal living room, and they came in and talked about marijuana and alcohol and how these kids were getting in trouble and blah, blah, blah. And we thanked them very much and, ushered them out the door. And then I turned to my husband and I said, we're not letting him hang out with that kid anymore. So, truthful denial went through our lives. And that's his story. I didn't know his story until we were co-speakers at a Alanon AA meeting years ago. And he was 22 at the time, and he's, put his phone down. He had his suit on, whatever it is, stand up, suit up, show up. And I didn't know his whole story. And he said, I'm 22 years, my name's Eric. I'm 22 years old. I did get permission to say his name. And he said, and I've never had a legal drink in my life. And if you've been in rehab, one of the things they'll talk about, or when you're working with your sponsor, talk about your reservations. What are your reservations about getting sober? Well, one of those reservations for him was being able to drink a toast at his wedding and the other was to by his brother, his older brother, 4 years old, who'd already been buying him alcohol until I took him off my payroll. And he said to buy his older brother a drink. And, basically you can buy your older brother a drink, but you just can't drink. You're just not drinking. So, that's his story. One of the things, you have tradition 3 here, the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. Well, the only requirement to be a member of Alanon is to have a problem of alcoholism in a family member or friend. And I am overqualified. I come from multi-generation of alcoholics and alcoholic behavior. Whether they were alcoholics or not, I don't really know. My father was a military man. He was probably suffered from anxiety, which I think goes through our whole family, just like alcohol. And he was 16, getting in trouble. And his brother, who was his older brother, his father was 50 when he was born. He was Irish Catholic. There's no way he wasn't going to be. The 5 of them, the 5 sons were all alcoholics. He went in the Navy. Now that's a real solution. Go into the service to try and get away from alcohol and trouble. Because what happens is you get on liberty and leave, and they go and binge, or they go to the AC/DC club because now they're allowed to drink on, regardless of how old they were, they're allowed to drink on the base. So there was a whole cycle there. So alcoholism preceded my birth. He married my mother. She was 18. They had no control over things. And I asked her, how come you stayed together? She said, well, we only got paid once a month. Her family was in New York City. He had moved her to, Virginia, I think. That's where I was conceived. And she said by the time he got paid and they had enough money for her to take a bus back up north, they'd been made up. So it became a vicious cycle. But my father was a great shipmate. He was a hard worker. He loved the United States of America. He loved me, but he loved alcohol more. And unfortunately, he was like 37 years old. He was worried about his heart. He was always a little somatic. And the doctor said, you've got to either quit drinking or smoking. So, of course, now the doctor didn't say quit both, because, doctors don't necessarily want to know about your drinking because they don't want to think about their own. So he says, go ahead and, I quit smoking. So he was a 3-pack-a-day Pall Mall, no filter cigarette smoker, but he quit, but drinking was not part of it. But later in life, he'd do this thing, well, I can quit, but he would white knuckle it from New Year's Day to St. Patrick's Day, the holy holiday of the Irish. And from then but he could not, he was just sober. He wasn't fun. He wasn't nice. He just wasn't drinking. He never, and when you say Mike talked about how his family talked about alcohol or a little bit about what was going on or his dad, we never talked about it because it didn't exist. It would be chaos in our house, and in those days, people just would knock on your door and come in, a neighbor or a friend or whatever. They'd knock on the door, come in, and in the midst of that, we'd be fighting. My parents would be fighting. My father would be critical of my mother. It was constant. And then we'd open the door and say, hi, come on in. Everybody want a drink? Come on in. It was like nothing ever happened. And I grew up like that. I grew up in a very unstable situation. My dad was transferred. We lived in 7 different states, and I went to like 9 different schools before the 6th grade. And, it's sink or swim when you're in those situations. And I then ended up living in an army town. I don't know whether you're familiar because this is Fort Bragg, but APG, Aberdeen Proving Ground, the home of the first computer. But we were there, and I had a really large graduating class, like 300 students were just in my senior class. And I saw a lot of kids who came through the military, who came through those kinds of moves and moved during their high school years. And it was a struggle, and you either sink or swim. So back to the AA and how I got in through AA. My son, my daughter died, and it was very public because it was this horrible accident. She was this delightful honor society. She was part of the marching band, all these things. People knew us that we didn't know. We came from a Pittsburgh suburb, and so we were well known. We were very active with our kids. I was very proud of being a good parent, and especially trying to be a good parent to your living children while you're mourning your child that died. And so it was embarrassing, along with the pain my son was going through and along with what I was feeling. So I decided I'm going to Alanon. The day he admitted himself at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon to rehab, I went to the Alanon meeting. And so I pull up next to this couple in the church. They're always at church. So I pull up and it was in a church that was in a building that had a loading dock, 2 entrances. So I'm like, I think I'm at this church. I'm at Crossroads Church. But the people next to me, I knew them because their daughter was in the same class as my son. She was a drama student. They were in plays. They were just these beautiful girls. These people went to church. I've seen them at our church. I've seen them at other churches. Like, I am sure that I'm in the wrong place. So I back my car out and I drive around to the other side. And I know I'm in the right place because there's guys outside smoking cigarettes, drinking coffee, having donuts. It's an AA meeting. So I roll down my window. It's winter. And, and with October's winter in Pittsburgh. August can be winter in Pittsburgh. But anyway, so I pull up and I say, do you know where the Alanon meeting is? They said, oh, yeah, we'll show you. So they come, park your car. They're really nice. They walk me through. They offer me coffee. They offer me a donut. They walk me through the back of where the AA meeting's can be happening, which is always a bigger room. I don't know why, because there's more people affected by alcohol than there probably are alcoholics. But anyway, they walk me through, and there's this big conference room table where I saw these nice people sitting, and where I saw this couple walk in, and they're sitting there, and we look at each other, and they burst into tears. I burst into tears because their daughter is also an alcoholic and is probably still out there, but they were there for the same purpose I was there, and we were in the right room. We were in there for our own recovery. So I sat down, and in that room they have our slogans. Do AAs have slogans like "Let go and let God" and first things first, progress not perfection? So the one facing me was "Let go and let God," and I'm like, okay, we're good. This is where I need to be. And there was a gentleman in the room, and he was a funny guy. He was a really great guy, actually, and he was chairing the meeting that night, and he said, we suggest you come to 6 meetings, and if after 6 meetings you decide it's not for you, then we'll be happy to reimburse you all your pain and suffering, and you can head on back out the door. He was an interesting guy. His wife finally got sober and then ran off with somebody from AA. So, it was just not a good scene for him. But he ended up being married to someone really nice in Alanon, and they mutually got together. But it was an interesting story. I'm like, all things happen, AA and Alanon. So they're connected. We are connected in a way that, can be positive. And I'm sorry that I couldn't be with my dad and be able to make amends to him for the way I would talk to him. Because, when they're drunk, you can say anything. Because tomorrow they don't remember. They don't want to remember even if they do remember. So, there would be fights, and I'd say things, and, I regret that because I didn't realize at the time it was a disease. With my son, I'm a gentler person, and I really was thinking, well, I'm really going to Alanon so that I understand his steps and what he's doing. But he would frequently remind me about whose side of the street I was on, and if I was crossing over. And it was a big help for me. It's a big help for me also to express my defects of character. Growing up in an alcoholic home, I felt that if I was just perfect enough, if I was just good enough, so it led me on a path to be perfect. And if I wasn't perfect, I would never come home and tell my parents if I got a C on a test. But I would tell them if I got an A, but they would never know if I got a C. because I was too embarrassed. I had to show perfection. And I brought that into my relationships with men. I didn't get married till I was 30, which is probably a smart thing in the first place. But I brought that into a lot of different situations. And I couldn't seem to find a way to get out of that until I got into Alanon. And I realized that I was powerless over people, places, and things. I was powerless over the alcoholics in my life. I was powerless over the women golfers who are really bitchy, that I golf with. I am powerless over those people. There is no way. And to accept that and to transfer it into my everyday life, to bring it into how I function, how I interact with the cashier, how I interact with the guy that just can't put his foot on the gas pedal when I am ready to go at the stop sign. It's not his fault. It's not his fault that he doesn't know how to drive. I just need to relax. And I was never chill. Not that I'm chill a lot now. You ask my husband, I don't know. But I'm much more chill than I ever was. And it's because of the program. It's because of the people in the program, the fellowship, sponsorship, following the steps, reading the literature, doing all the things that you guys are doing. And it just really helped me in my relationships in general. Very much so, my relationship with my son who's an alcoholic. I have another son who drinks, but he's not an alcoholic, or he doesn't see himself as one. I don't see him as one. He doesn't have those same behaviors. There's a difference, and that is the hardest thing, and no one can decide that but the people who call themselves alcoholics. I've come to realize that is not something, not everybody gets the disease. And I would talk to my children, that's why I thought I was such a good parent. I would say to them, when you drink alcohol, it's going to be different than other people because you've got this biological factor working on you. And, it can affect you differently, which it does. It works in your brain. I'll tell you just a little quick story about my son. When he was in his rehab, of course, I thought when I went to see him the first time, he'd show me all this remorse. He hit this car, he's got all this stuff. Instead, he's looking at me kind of dazed, and, that's probably because he was on the Librium, I'm like, what the heck's going on? And I'm like, I didn't understand why but he wanted to tell me that he was not in the right place. I'm not in the right place because he was just under enough age to get into a 28-day young adult program. Because if he had gotten the adult program, all he would have found is more people to buy him alcohol. Because 50% of those people are going back out and using. So I'm like, this is not going to work. So I said, well, but of course I want to help him. I'm still trying to enable this whole situation. And so I called the social worker. And she said to me, he's exactly where he needs to be. Because he said, well, there's 13-year-olds in here farting. And I'm like, well, you're not much better. I've lived with 2 sons. I get it. And making jokes about that. They're not serious. I need to be with adults, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, she said, this young man is very sick. And I had no idea how sick he was. She said, he was in detox for 5 days. He was a very sick young man. One night he had a seizure. We had to bring him to the hospital. I'm like, reality sets in. And I realized then that I could not help him. I could not be that person. He needed to help himself, and I needed to get help for myself. And that's where I am a grateful member of Alanon, and particularly a grateful member of the Courage to Change Monday night group here. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight.